Welcome to the first in a series of dialogues focused on powering Africa. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is starved for electricity. The region's power sector is significantly underdeveloped, whether we look at energy access, installed capacity, or in fact overall consumption. Importantly, there's a direct correlation between economic growth and electricity supply. If Sub-Saharan Africa is to fulfill its promise, it needs power and lots of it. Joining me to take the discussion further, Brian Dames, the CEO of African Rainbow Energy and Power, Jay Island, President and CEO of GE Africa, Andrew Herskowitz, who's the coordinator of Power Africa, and Max Jarrett, Deputy Director of the Africa Progress Panel via Skype from France. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Let's start, Brian, with African Rainbow Energy and Power. You've been focused on surveying the current landscape and looking for opportunities to close the energy gap. What are your observations to this point?
I think the first observation is quite clear that we were right that this is one of the fastest growing markets. Never mind energy markets. It is Africa's the fastest growing energy markets globally. And the opportunities are vast, from South Africa all the way up to as far north as Egypt. On the other hand, you also have this great wealth of endowment on the continent. The continent can be energy self-sufficient. The third aspect is that we have this great revolution around the renewable energy that has come along and can assist the continent, similar to the mobile phones did around connectivity. Similarly, can you have transformation in terms of the energy sector to address the issues of energy access? And so both with technology, with the sources that we have, with the potential we have, there is a huge potential. The question now is, how do we then find an opportunity to partner with financiers, with policymakers, to make sure this happens in a consistent manner over a long term in the continent. And I think that is some of the work we've been doing with our partners from GE and even Power Africa.
Jay, this is a landscape that you know well, warts and all, so perhaps let's get your perspective.
Sure. Well, I agree with Brian. The self-sufficiency of Africa from a standpoint of fuels is excellent. Whether it's, water, wind, geothermal, sun, gas, coal, everything's here. The question is there has to be some development in some countries to make sure that you get the right fuel source, and I think there's a balance of what needs to be done in each one of the utilities around base load versus incremental power from different sources, et cetera. So I think that's key. But there's no dearth of potential opportunities. The biggest fuel source that we need is money for projects, and that's the financing, which Brian referenced. And I think that's a key thing that from our standpoint, we continue to work pretty hard on trying to develop alternative sources of financing, as well as bringing in new people that want to invest in projects in Africa. And I think when you see a long-term power project, a long-term, long-running potentially power project matching potentially long-running asset requirements, I think there's a lot of potential there. We just need to make sure that we can bring some of these parties together.
From the Obama-backed Power Africa initiative, some would say the money is there, but we need predictability on the African continent for that money to be safely deployed.
And when President Obama launched Power Africa here in South Africa 3 years ago, he had this vision of saying we need to work together because the resources are there, as Brian's mentioned. You have incredible winds in Kenya. You've got vast solar resources. You have more than enough power not to just power the continent. You could power the world with the resources that Africa has. The money's there. And I wouldn't have said that a few years ago, but there's so much interest in investing on the continent. We just came back from a trip to Japan, because Japan is now one of the Power Africa partners. One of the Japanese agencies only has 2% of its portfolio invested in the African continent. So there's a tremendous appetite for that investment. What we're doing, now Power Africa has over 130 partners, and these are some of our partners sitting here, is we're trying to figure out how do you bring the money, how do you identify the projects? And I'll say, the projects are there as well. Power Africa launched a roadmap We launched an app available in the iTunes store called the Power Africa Tracking Tool that anyone can download and see the deal flow that's there. But what you need is the predictability. It's a market of 50 countries, and you need countries that are willing to make the reforms so that businesses and investors will make the investments necessary to let these projects move forward.
So Max, let's bring you in here from an Africa Progress panel perspective. You are at the forefront of policy discussions across the African continent. How do we get that predictability and the political will really to create an enabling environment?
I mean, you say how will we get that? I think it's already there now. For a long time, we didn't have a critical mass of political will to try and address the energy challenge in Africa. But the tide has turned, and we have that now. The issue is, how do you scale that up? And I agree with everything that the other panel members have already said in terms of predictability, that the money being there and so forth. But what all of them haven't said enough is that it's all about the politics, really. The politicians have to seize this agenda as a #1 priority across the board. It shouldn't just be an issue for energy ministers, finance ministers. It's for the whole of government, actually for the whole of society. Because for too long, we've had energy being treated in Africa as a kind of a sideshow in a way, where some make money from it and others just essentially sit there as consumers, either getting their supply or not getting it. So I think that at the moment, what we need to really focus on is seeing how we can scale up this political will. And the new agenda initiative that's been put forward by the president of the African Development Bank, Akin Adesina, the New Deal for Energy in Africa, is one which we urge all others to get behind. And there's also, of course, the African Leaders on Energy Group, which is another a key initiative that is trying to spearhead this. So we have more and more leaders seizing this this challenge as also an opportunity to transform their countries and the region. But we still need many more on board, and that's one of the key things that the Africa Progress Panel is advocating for.
Well, let's talk about that, the scaling up of the political will. Andy, let's get a viewpoint from yourself. I mean, there, Max mentioning President Adesina, we know well that he is at the forefront of lighting up and powering Africa, one of the high fives of the African Development Bank. But it's about the scale, and it's not there. I mean, if we really cut through the quick, it's not there.
So the scale can be there, and President Adesina, we work very, very closely. In fact, African Development Bank was one of the founding partners of Power Africa, committed $3 billion to it, and already they've exceeded their original financing commitment. So we work with them side by side, and that's one of the things that's happening with all these initiatives that different governments and entities launch. People wonder, are we competing with one another? The answer is absolutely not. We are on the phone almost every day trying to figure out how we can collectively make a difference. But how you get that scale, and this is what Power Africa is trying to do, is you get the first of the kind deal across the finish line in a country. So for example, in Zambia, they just announced a solar project where the price is priced competitively with fossil fuels. And that was Power Africa working with the World Bank Group and the government of Zambia. And people see that it can be done on the continent. They negotiate that first deal, and our hope is that once they negotiate that first one, the second one's easier. Tanzania, the same thing. I got pictures yesterday from one of our partners who's already building, just started breaking ground on a 5-megawatt solar project there. It's first of its kind. But what everyone has learned, both in the government and in the investment sector from that project, it de-risks the deal. Because when people see that it can get done, that people will get paid and they'll get paid on time, the cost of capital will come down.
I agree, and they're brilliant examples, and we're going to spend some time highlighting examples of what is being accomplished on the continent. But I still want to put this issue to bed, and I'm going to come to you, Jay, and then I'm coming to you, Brian. Do we have enough political will right now to dramatically change the African continent from an energy perspective?
I mean, I look at it from a standpoint of one of the key things for any investor is consistency, political consistency across administration changes or elections. And I think that's always a key thing. So when an administration comes in and then all of a sudden changes a tariff policy or some other, an IPP, an independent power producing policy, et cetera, that all of a sudden throws kind of the investors. Yeah, and you have to kind of start all over, because that's the key thing you want to do when you're investing over a 10 to 15, 20-year period. You want to make sure there's some security around your investment. And I think there's a little bit of that still needs to be earned, if you will. But But I think, again, because the other piece of that makes it so expensive is the money becomes short term because no one's willing to take these long-term bets. And that's much more expensive. And so I think from that standpoint, there still needs to be work to be done. And I think that's where a Power Africa can help from a government to government kind of discussion. It's hard for the private sector guys to talk to government about it. They understand our position, but I think it's also a view of how we can continue to work together and trying to get that consistency.
If I can jump in, I mean, this is a great point. I mean, one of the things that we tell governments is that it doesn't matter whether it's a 1 megawatt project or a 1,000 megawatt project. If you suddenly change the rules of the game when a company's been trying to move forward on this investment for 2 years and it's going to fall apart, just like we all know one another and we talk to one another regularly, the investors talk to one another and they'll say, at any given moment, this is a good place to invest or it's not a good place to invest. And sometimes the country, maybe they're not going to get the absolute lowest price that they might be able to get, but they'll get a good deal and a sustainable deal, and you have to demonstrate to the market that your country is a good place to do business and it's predictable, it's reliable. That's the role that we're trying to play, is trying to make sure that everyone understands the implications of every step that happens in different ministries, and they have to talk to one another.
Brian, as an investor in this space, are you comfortable to widely deploy money into energy across Africa?
The continent has made huge progress around this issue of consistency. It is very important. I mean, typically, these are 20, 30-year transactions, and you need to be sure over that period you're going to get paid. And most of these are project finance, which would go out to 15 years or 20 years. Now, that's long-term, and so consistency across all sorts of changes is crucially important. A lot is done. So I agree with the scale-up point. But I don't, the scale-up of political support is important, and we've discussed that. But we also have to scale up solutions around how do you find things that work, and South Africa is a very good example of things that works. Yes, there are some issues that currently everybody's dealing with, but it works. It's absolutely world-class. Now, if you can scale that up regionally, you start providing solutions that attract a broader range of investors. You see, 5 megawatts is fine, but if you really want to drive energy on the continent, you need to do what either China or India is doing and putting 175 megawatts of renewable energy in, for the next 20 years. Now that is what you have to then scale up, and we have to find mechanisms to do that. The last point I'd like to make, it is fine to talk to governments about consistency of policy, but the solutions must also create scale-up of African entities that can deliver this for its people going forward. That will be here. GE will not leave the continent. They've been around, but we're going nowhere. And so you need people here to look after these assets that will keep on investing. And secondly, you need to create industries and not just leave the project, but have changed the lives of the skills that you've transferred onto the continent, the capability that you've created in manufacturing. So if you do have scale, you can actually do quite a bit across the continent to achieve objectives more than just delivering the power.
So Max, let's come back to you and focus on the solutions as Brian has shifted the conversation. And let's talk about renewables. And what everyone is saying is, and I'm sorry to use the old adage, that renewable technology can achieve the leapfrogging of energy solutions on the African continent. Let's get your view.
I totally agree. I mean, I find this conversation a little bit surprising for me because I'm known to my close friends as a contrarian, but today I'm sitting here and taking part in a discussion where I'm agreeing with everything everyone else is saying. Regarding solutions, this is one of the things that we at the Africa Progress Panel are trying to find out more about and promote and kind of highlight in the reports we put out. We have a report that came out last year, the Power People Planet report, and we're working on a new one right now, looking exactly that, because a lot of things are happening on the African continent right now, but in a way, not everyone knows about them. East Africa, there's a lot of things going on there regarding renewables, also some things in North Africa, which people in West Africa, where I'm from, might not necessarily know about. And the thing is, most of these projects, though, are not yet at the scale that one needs to really meet the energy challenge on the continent, where of course we still have over 621 million people without access to modern energy. So I agree with that. And I think though where I would actually disagree a little bit with what Brian said is that when we talk about solutions, government also has a role to play in that as well, because there is a lot of R&D and innovation going on at a small scale in some parts of Africa. What it would take to really scale this up and make this a regional solutions kind of base or hubs is for government working with maybe international partners to put more money in there to develop the solutions at scale that we need to kind of address the renewables opportunities that we have. So in my honest opinion is that solutions are there. It's a bit bitty in a way because it's not regionally at scale yet, but we're working to try and spread the news about what is going on, and we really hope that more people get on board there to put the money that's needed to actually get these African solutions for African challenges scaled up.
Jay, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think to that point, you know, you've got to look at energy from two prongs. One is in Africa. One is availability, which really drives economic growth, and then there's accessibility, which is the 500 million people that don't have access to electricity. And really the solutions are different, and I think that's a place from a government standpoint is to understand and push solutions that will solve both. So the availability piece are the big projects, the ones that are going to fuel, you know, investment into manufacturing facilities, services, et cetera. And that's going to be a combination of baseload, incremental power across all the fuel spectrums. So there's a portfolio of assets that the power producers can bring in with cost and or availability. Then there's accessibility, and that's really, I think that's where and this is where Africa has an edge. The entrepreneurs are going to solve that, whether it's singular solar home systems, utilizing, I would call it a virtual grid, which is the money, M-Pesa, the mobile money, that being the driver rather than a physical grid of electrons going through wires. So I think that's the view, and I think the aspect of thinking that the grid is going to be run out to 500 million people is not the right way to think about it. So I think if we break it into those two roles and then have different programs and different capabilities in each one is really a way to solve
Brian, I know you want to come in, but there is a point here on the off-grid solutions, particularly in East Africa, that government has now come and started to regulate. Now that could be working basically against what we're trying to achieve.
Right. So one of the things that I always talk about, and actually I love being with these guys because they focus on the big grid level projects, but both of them also, both GE and Brian through his role with UN Sustainable Energy for All, are also very concerned about the access for people who will never be connected to the grid, or at least not for generations. What I consistently say, and what I love about Power Africa's off-grid partners, we have 40 of them, and we have a goal of 60 million connections, and most of those will not be through grid connections, is that you have companies that are being successful because the government is not involved. My government is not very involved, and the African governments are not very involved. A person can get connected to an M-Copa, a off-grid electric, a Mobi Solar, any of these great companies, and in a day a person can have a solar panel that's not just powering a light bulb, but it's powering super efficient appliances. Electric razors where a barber can cut people's hair. I talked to a guy in Rwanda who said he can cut 50 people's hair a day with this one small solar panel. Compare that to a barber working in Lagos whose power goes out all the time, who can't run his business. So some of these people are realizing they can live a life like the life on the grid with televisions that are only drawing 7 watts of power, radios, irons. These are things that people can get for cents or dollars a day, and this is solutions that the private sector is bringing. The problem is that the government's now coming in and trying to regulate it a bit more, and it's increasing the cost. Who does that hurt? It hurts the consumer, but it's going to hurt the government at the end of the day because you're going to have people who will remain impoverished, who won't be able to increase the tax
Before
base.
we get to the negative, let's celebrate the positive, because Brian's nodding away, entrepreneurship.
It is, this technology allows for a great sense of new players to come into the market and for creativity to be solved by the private sector and not having governments trying to solve it. So let's just take a step back. Africa is physically just too large to have everybody connected to the grid. Yes, we need large grids, and I agree fully with Jay, and we must do that. The large projects have strong interconnectors to where we can develop Africa's least cost generation projects, supply options, and link that to different countries and let countries get energy security through that. But to address the millions of people that don't have access, we would have to find a leapfrogging technology, and it is off-grid, but maybe more than that. You know, mini grids will come along with battery storage and a combination. It will happen at a cost that is affordable, and that is where we should allow, because Africa is just too big for us to get to energy access and energy security at the same time.
So we're talking about solutions now. Let's deal with this negative. How do we have to have government regulating this space and being an impediment to the growth?
So I think there is a role for government to regulate to some degree, but what we're seeing, I think, well, governments who are well-intentioned, they're trying to increase the tax base and figure out what they can do. They're not realizing the impacts of suddenly taxing parts and accessories. In fact, I was speaking to a company that was importing solar panels and systems, and I asked them, why aren't you producing it locally? They said, well, if we produce it locally, we get taxed, we have to pay VAT taxes on each part individually. But when we bring it in as a system, it's exempt from VAT taxes. And the question is, well, the government is shooting itself in the foot. There could be local production. You see this across the continent. So we work very closely with the Global Off-Grid Lighting Association, which has members that understand all of these issues. So we're working very closely with the governments, and a lot of the governments are starting to come around. But this needs to get solved because these partners are adding thousands of new customers a month in rural areas, people who otherwise would have been burning kerosene. And if we all try to get too involved in it, those people will no longer be getting connected.
What about governments incentivizing entrepreneurs in this space?
Well, I think when you talk about entrepreneurs in general, but not just in the power, I think one of the issues around innovation in Africa is having the appropriate environment, typically driven a lot by government, some of the stuff that Andy's talked about, but it's also having more depth in financial markets and liquidity. You know, if you think about a very deep financial market like that, which is the U.S., you got venture capitalists, you've got private equity, et cetera. That's not as developed here. And once that starts coming, you're also going to see the ability to finance a lot of these ideas that these entrepreneurs have, because there's a hotbed of potential opportunity. We're working on providing with the U.S. Africa Development Fund, $100,000 grants. We've given out 30 of them to off-grid power guys that have these very small ideas that hopefully can grow into things. But you know, it's going to take time. So I think having that culture of entrepreneur capability, getting a collaborative workspaces, things like that. We're investing in a little bit of that in Kenya and Nigeria, but there's a lot more that has to be done.
Max, let's get your thoughts before we close out on the first half of our discussion.
Yeah, I just want to say that regulation is not a bad word here. It's what and how. And then secondly, we've got multifaceted challenges before us, so we cannot take a binary approach to dealing with them, i.e., you know, either grid or off-grid. It's everything. We want everything that can meet the challenge should be explored and scaled up. And I think coming from a media background, we need to move now in the same way that the media sector moved over 25 years ago, from just single state regulators and single state broadcasters to, you know, FM radios everywhere. The energy sector must also be treating the challenges and the opportunities in the same way. So regulation is not bad, government is not bad, you just got to do things properly and harmonize so you don't shoot yourselves in the foot, as Andy was just saying.
Well, the debate on powering Africa is heating up here in the studio. We're taking a short break and we'll be back shortly with this powerful discussion. Welcome back. We're focusing on powering Africa. Still with me in studio, Brian Dom is the CEO of African Rainbow and Energy and Power. Jay Island, the President and CEO of GE Africa. Andrew Herskowitz of Power Africa, and Max Jarrett, Deputy Director of the Africa Progress Panel, joining us via Skype from France, just signaling that he's there with us. I think we should take a step back and perhaps for the 48 countries that we're broadcasting to at this point, and the people that are taking part in this discussion and listening to this discussion, we unpack some of the terms that we're talking about. And maybe one of the big terms that we should really take a little bit more time to explore is the renewable space versus the fossil fuel space. Can I hand that to you, Brian?
Yeah, I think when we look at, one of the key things that needs to enable all of what we're talking about, I think needs to rely on very sound energy planning. And energy planning as to what a country or a region needs is crucially important in also understanding where the country is going around its economic growth. Then the shape of that growth. Is it energy intensive? Is it driven by services industries? Those are crucially important. And then making decisions very important around the impacts of climate change on that. And climate change for Africa has starting to do with how do we adapt to the impacts of climate change. It's not about necessarily the CO2 going out. It is how do you deal with greater droughts? How do you deal with greater storms and aspects such as all of that needs to be incorporated in the energy planning perspective. And countries, and South Africa has done that, needs to then understand how do I make choices. And I think the key conclusion for me is Africa needs a mix of energy choices to satisfy its needs going forward, both for access as well as for driving economic growth. But it's very difficult. Renewables are not baseload, and baseload is not clean. Coal is not clean, and
geothermal, and hydro.
Yeah, but you need scale. You need significant. We must understand Africa, outside of South Africa, generates 60 gigawatts. 60 gigawatts is as much as the whole of Spain. Now, that is grossly unacceptable. South Africa's energy intensity is massive with this massive system it has. You need to take and you need to develop large projects, baseload projects, that you can then complement with the likes of renewables. But it's very difficult to compare solar with wind, or for that matter with coal, because when the sun shines and the sun doesn't shine, the coal produces. So you need both of these. And what we have seen is that certainly the cost of renewables has come down significantly, and certainly comparable and even sometimes cheaper with baseload. But you need a mix of both of these.
Let's focus on the mix from your perspective, Jay.
Yeah, well, I agree with Brian. One of the key technology here that's going to make renewables potentially baseload is going to be energy storage. And we don't have the answer yet. Everyone's working on it, but that's the key to take it when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, that you can then still have energy produced from that source. But I think part of the issue is making sure that, especially when you look at it from an African context, to Brian's point, the coal, the oil and gas, those are industries in this continent that generate a lot of jobs and a lot of economic growth too. So that's got to be part of the thought process around it. Number one. Number two, in developing renewable projects, which I always find talking to people that are not in Africa, is there's still difficult issues. Land rights with big solar farms or big wind farms, same thing with hydro projects on the environmental impact. So all those things that people look about in the West around those renewable things, it's the same thing here in Africa. And so those have to be played in too, especially in the development of a lot of these projects. So it's not an easy answer. It's not an apples to apples comparison. There's a way to do both. And I think the key is for governments to really understand what it is that they bring, what the country itself brings from a standpoint of potential fuel sources. Because the wind isn't great everywhere else. It is great in East Africa, good down in here in South Africa, but hydro, I live in Kenya. When it doesn't rain, we lose a lot of base load. So I mean, those are the kind of things that have to be managed.
And there are a lot of solutions and no perfect solutions, as Jay's pointing out. I mean, we look in the United States, for example, it would be disingenuous for us to launch Power Africa and say, but don't take advantage of your fossil fuels, when we're powering our economy with gas, and gas is cleaner than other fossil fuels. But what was driving Power Africa was looking at countries which were enjoying rapid economic growth trajectories. Countries that, like in Kenya, where you have a garment manufacturer that's producing 40,000 garments a day, suddenly the power goes out, it's employing thousands of people, and their only alternative is to run a dirty diesel backup generator. You need to figure out how do you get an inexpensive solution that can help make sure that that garment manufacturer can remain competitive. So Power Africa, we look at gas. I mean, a lot of the projects that we support are gas projects, but we're also trying to figure out on the renewable space, how can you make it so that renewables can provide more power over long periods of time? The energy storage issue, that's going to completely transform the market. But we're also looking at other baseload power sources. In East Africa, you've got tremendous geothermal power, which can provide power 24 hours a day. Kenya is developing project after project. We've been working hard with Ethiopia to develop its geothermal resources as well, and that can be cost competitive. So there are renewable solutions that are base load, that are cost competitive, but we're looking at everything because there's no one answer and every country is unique.
Max, let's draw from the report People, Power, Planet, penned by the Africa Progress panel, in terms of the mix and the stance that the panel has taken on exactly what we're chatting about here in studio.
Before we come to exactly what the stance the panel has taken, I just want to say that I'm a Pan-Africanist, and I've been that since I was a teenager. And the politics is also critical here, because we have to take a geopolitical approach to power as well. If we talk of things such as hydro, we have issues, for example, like the Inga Dam, which could actually, it's renewable, but if we fix the politics around that and then the financing, we could have a major baseload renewable power source right there in Africa.
All right,
Also, we go to say, for example,
Max, hang on.
Yes.
There were a couple of nods around the table on that point.
I agree with Max on that, and it's crucially important to solve that. But, you know, we've been trying to solve that for 20, 30 years. Now, I do suggest that there are no regret options to implement immediately. You know, those are sound for both an economic case and so those big ones are crucially important. We should never stop working on them. But for heaven's sake, you know, there are smaller hydro projects that can work, you know, and the issues around the drought and the climate change impact on changes in weather is huge.
Brian, you've got Max hot under the collar. Max, right to respond.
Because I was interrupted. I was going to say Inga is the grand mega project, but I spent 13 years in Ethiopia, and I was there from 2001 to 2013, and I saw what also they did with hydro. It was controversial, of course, but also it had a regional dimension with the whole Nile waters and whatever. Yeah. But because they were able to move ahead with that, we've seen the growth in Ethiopia based largely on that, addressing that baseload renewable power option that the Ethiopians have exploited. So there's always politics around it. And in terms of how you deploy your energy mix, the APP report and our panel, Mr. Allen, we've always been pushing the need to take a very judicious approach to how the energy mix each country and each region has before it is deployed. If you're, for example, in Liberia, you have a hydro source, you have oil that you're importing, but you can fix your hydro and therefore decrease the amount of oil you use, and of course you want to do that. But other countries might have a different options. The key is every country needs to be mindful of the need to transition as fast as possible to a low carbon energy system within the region and within the country. So
and not every
we
country
can't
has
stop.
to be energy self-sufficient either. Not every country needs to be, because...
No.
Go ahead.
Exactly.
No, and I don't want to stop the debate, and I see why you were hot under the collar there, Max, because I interrupted you at an inappropriate point. You were making a different point, but it's good. It's stimulated debate. I do want to say something on Inga, though. We spoke at the beginning of the session on political will, and that the political will is there, to the point that it's taken 20 years to get any political will around Inga Dam. Puts that conversation, I'm afraid, to bed on the negative side. Anybody want to challenge me on that?
No, I think there's been a lot of progress on that recently, you know, but you need countries, it's government to governments to unlock this. You know, South Africa is 5 countries away. You know, it's quite a long way to then build. It's not impossible. It's more than doable. But also Inga, you don't have to do the 40,000 megawatts plus project. There are phases to it.
Let me rephrase the question. Is political will, the biggest, or lack of political will, the biggest inhibitor to Inga? And then we'll put this one to bed. Brian, Damas, yes or no?
Yeah, it's always been the case.
Can I leave it there?
Yeah.
Right, so let's go back to regional power pools, because I think Inga does bring a very important large scale, and I agree with you, we've got to look at the smaller scale projects. I think you're all very clear on that and what entrepreneurs and small businesses can do in the power space. But regional power pools, is that not one way of fast tracking the energy access, the energy consumption across the African continent, Jay?
Well, I think, Andy brought up a good point, which is, every country they don't have the capability to solve their own energy problem, depending on what fuel is, as Max said, what's there in the country and what they can take advantage of. So I think from that standpoint, there has to be coordination and cooperation within regional power pools. And as Brian said, there is a limit to how far you can transfer electricity without losing, too much value, et cetera. So there's that balance that has to happen. And, there's a lot of places set up you've got ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, et cetera, around economic cooperation, but that still has to, we have the West Africa gas pipeline, which is, doesn't always work. So there has to be a coordination. It's political will, but it's also an accountability and responsibility. Accountability for the suppliers to always supply, and responsibility from the takers that they're always going to be taking, because there's an economic value on both sides. And I think that's what gets lost in the discussion, is when you get down to the nitty-gritty of contracts of how much offtake is one country going to take, or how much power is one going to provide consistently. And that's what's been
so it's
some
a tough
of the
negotiation.
issues.
Again, comes back
it's no
to
different than a commercial
Well,
negotiation.
it's even political. We talk about political will within one country to get a project completed. Now you're talking about several countries agreeing on who's going to get the power. So the approach that we've been taking with Power Africa, our partners, we support a lot of the work with the power pools, because what we realize is it doesn't make sense for one country to produce geothermal power that's going to cost them 35 cents a kilowatt hour if 2 years from now they'll be able to import electricity from another country for 7 cents a kilowatt hour. But what we're trying to do is take this transactional approach and look at a regional project that will force the power trade. That's going to be the carrot, so that a country can see, I can get power for 7 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 15 cents, and I'm going to make this work. Politically, I'm going to make this work and negotiate with my neighboring countries. The projects are going to have to drive the development of the power pools. And I think this is the model that Power Africa takes. We can, development professionals can come in and opine all they want about all the things that need to be done for development, but the Power Africa approach is to look at the actual deal and figure out how to overcome those obstacles to force the development, because you have that carrot and that solution there.
Max?
Yeah, I want to follow up on what Andy said. The projects will drive the development of the power pools, and the power pools, I think, will drive the development of real regional integration in Africa. If we compare with what actually happened in Europe, where it started with energy, European coal and steel community, and we see where they are now, though despite the problems they have, you saw something quite effective. I think if we go from the projects to the power pools to then having us all linked up through energy, then we really are on course towards a true African integration, I think.
Can I make one point? I think Brian hit on it, which is, and it gets into this regional power pool approach too. These are big ideas. These are big things. There's not one country right now that produces enough power for their own use, let alone having to export it. Number one. Number two is, to Brian's point, we need to have both a long-term vision around big long-term projects, but we got to be bringing, 50, 100 megawatt projects on every few months to continue to try to close that gap of the availability issue.
So that's the no regret option, less capital and shorter time frames from when you start to when you finish.
So much more investor friendly.
And you can, around that, finance it, attract privates. No African country can ensure their own energy security. And so Africa cannot do that through every country developing its own project. It has to do that through large transmission integration. The second point is, no government can do it on its own. You would have to get the private sector involved. And you need to create that consistency around policy frameworks. And so these no regret options, both from a positive climate business case, whether it's geothermal, whether it's small hydros, whether it's renewables, allows countries to move forward. But we should not forget about the grid integrations that needs to be done across the continent, because that becomes a key enabler for many of these things.
Borrowing from a McKinsey report, electrification in many countries across Africa way below even 13%. To get that up to, well, to get an electrification status of an economy from 20% to 80% takes 25 years, according to the McKinsey report. We're going to have to fast track. We don't have 25 years.
It doesn't have to. So there's a couple of reasons why people don't have access to power. There's several. One is most countries don't charge the actual cost of power. And if you're not charging the actual cost of power, your utility is going to be bankrupt. It's not going to be a good investment and investors won't come in. And to say that people won't pay for the cost of power, it's not true, because we see it again and again in the off-grid space where people are actually paying sometimes 10 times the cost of what they would pay if they were connected to the grid for a solar panel. And they're willing to pay for it because what they want is dependability. They want to know that their power is not going to get cut off. And some of them are opting to not even go on the grid. And then you have people who steal power, companies, governments, who are stealing power. We went into one country and we saw that they were suffering about 80% losses, sometimes from government entities that weren't paying their bills. So they're not either stealing it or not paying their bills. You have to fix that problem as well. That requires political will. Power Africa, in our roadmap, we lay out exactly how you can achieve this, both through on-grid and through off-grid. Combination of rooftop solar, mini grids, getting people who live close to the grid, within a kilometer, who aren't connected. How can you get those people connected to the grid? The solutions are there. It's political will.
I want to focus on corruption for an issue.
Yeah, but I also just want to address, you have to think about how society drives changes in systems, and energy system is just one example. I mean, in Africa, we're going to see greater urbanization. So, most countries has achieved a greater sense of energy access through, dealing with electricity and urban infrastructure. And because we're going to have bigger and more cities, and we should plan those, we should make sure they've got the energy infrastructure. We can put power projects very close to them to address them. We should be careful to the likes of the problems that China has with Beijing and smog and all of that, and hence the finding cleaner solutions to deal with that. But it's more than doable. Through that, we can aggressively drive energy access. And then we must find the solutions, off-grid solutions, to deal with the rural areas.
Max, can I bring you in on this corruption issue, and Andy mentioning governments in some instances stealing power? I know that you yourself have been very outspoken on this issue, and that more needs to be done to curb corruption, specifically in the energy space in Africa.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Andy says. And we've actually been looking at this, and we're going to be having some findings, recommendations in our next report that's coming out soon. We need utilities in Africa now that are fit for purpose, not just purpose in terms of, the grid and so forth, but for where we're heading in the next, say, 25 to 30 years. And to be honest, I don't think that most utilities on the continent are in that space yet. To do that, we need to clean them up, make them better managed, give them the latest state-of-the-art kind of technology, both in terms of the infrastructure technology, but also in terms of management and management thinking. Because don't forget, it's not just the equipment that in many places is moribund. It's just the whole way the systems are managed and governed and people, operate them. That needs to change as well. There's some state-of-the-art thinking that's going on, for example, with utilities in the United States and in parts of Asia. Let's try and replicate that in Africa as well. And the way we'll be able to do that, though, is to get more money into the system by people paying their bills. And what we've also already found is that some of the people who are the most to blame for not paying is actually governments, rich businessmen.
That was a pregnant pause if I've ever seen one.
I was wondering what I was going to say.
I'm sure you'll come back.
I will say that sometimes the reason they don't pay is a good one. They're angry because often they're getting charged for power that they're not using. So it's not a black-white issue. There's a lot of gray here in terms of why businesses and others don't pay.
In South Africa, you now have a country that's fundamentally transformed around energy access. I mean, in 1991, you had this massive energy system that served about 30% of South Africans. Today, it serves close to 90% of South Africans. And I've personally, we've rolled this out, hundreds and thousands of connections a year, and I've seen the impacts on people. And in one of these occasions, I remember very clearly, somebody said to me, a leader, said to me, be careful when you bring energy access to those that don't have it, that you don't perpetuate the discrimination. And really what they were saying is in the way you deliver the solutions, that it is as world-class as what you have in the city, that it is as world-class as those 30% that had it, that it's reliable, dependable, and people can build sustainable communities around it. So it's a crucially important point. And for that, our communities will support that because it'll change their lives.
Coming back, Jay, to the point that Brian is making, do you want to elaborate, or can I take you to another place that I'm sure?
Either. I just think, I think the urbanization point is an important point for Africa. That's going to continue, and that's going to really drive a lot of the economic growth. And I think from that standpoint, when we look at, obviously we sell power solutions across every fuel source, but we also build factories. And so if someone comes to me and says, well, I want you to build a factory in whatever country it is, you look for two key things. One is security of supply of power, and then security of good logistics. So you can count on both. And that's what we still need to do in majority of African countries, is to get that thought process around power, which is what we're talking about, but there's also others with logistics, et cetera.
And that's been done in the US and in Europe and many other countries. Cities used to drive the electricity systems. And so the creation of RW, EONs, even the likes of Eskom, came out of the mines, close to where the load is. And I would suggest that city solution is crucially important for Africa.
Andy, I'm likely to get walloped by all of you for what I'm about to say, but Power Africa, the UK, the UN Sustainable Energy for All, the UK's Energy Africa, the Power People Planet organization within the Africa Progress Panel. Should I go on? There are other organizations.
No, there's a lot more, yeah.
No, you don't have enough time.
You know my point. So what I want to understand is whether there's duplication of effort, whether perhaps synergy amongst all the players who are trying to transform the African landscape from an energy perspective, from a collective perspective, would change the game.
So the fact that you're talking to all of us and that we all speak on a regular basis should give you some indication that all of these different initiatives, no matter what the political branding is, one of the things that's unique, and I think Power Africa helped push for this, is that we all are working together. We're trying to make sure we're not stepping on one another's toes. Sometimes we do, but Power Africa was sort of founded on this premises of 12 US government agencies working together. Now imagine any government in the world where all the agencies get along with one another. The 12 US government agencies don't always agree with one another because we have different mandates. But we took that model of coordination and discussion to figure out how to get to solutions and how to get deals across a finish line. And then we started adding other partners: Sweden, Norway, Canada, Japan, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, NEPAD, Sustainable Energy for All, the UK. But
so
what we do is
everybody is working together.
We're
is
all
what you're
working
saying
together.
To me.
In fact, we try to put whoever is best at doing something out in front. So this is why the World Bank launched its Scaling Solar program. Power Africa is supporting that. We didn't invent our own grid level solar program. The UK had its Energy Access campaign for rooftop solar. We're supporting what they're doing. So we try to coordinate and figure out who can do what best and still leave some competition in it. So
the point I would like to make is, I've observed this for many years now, and sometimes I have a sense that everybody comes to Africa, and I guess if you were Minister of Energy in an African country, you have today somebody with this project and tomorrow with that energy project, and by the end of it you're really confused as to, so everybody drives their own, I sometimes call them pet projects. And there is a need for Africans themselves to start shaping the agenda as to what we need and how do we build these partnerships. So yes, that's correct. A lot of people, globally, funders, organizations are trying to solve this problem in various ways. And I think we sometimes fall over each other's feet. I would suggest that Africans take a greater ownership of that and start driving that agenda and the partnerships, because, I hope it will proceed after President Obama. By Africa, but what if it's not there? We can't be, as a continent, then be left with nothing. So,
we're the guys that are, putting the power projects into on the ground and stuff. And there's a lot of, as you said, all these different entities, and there's a lot of studies and all that. But when we get down to getting projects going and getting equipment running, there's a couple of key things. One is there's still a real lack of speed of getting these things through the I'll call it the administrative process. Once you break ground, getting those in, getting a power project on doesn't take a lot of time. We have demonstrated this in Egypt, where we in 6 months brought a gigawatt of power on. And we have that capability, but it's all of the negotiation, in which a lot of these groups are helping, but we're still not where we need to be, number one. Number two, I think, is from a standpoint of making sure that the understanding of what Brian said is you have to be on the ground. There's too many project developers that fly in, fly out. They think they got the solution. It has to be people that are here living it and understand it and work with everywhere. You got to work on power. You got to work with the government. We have brought on 11 gigawatts of power in the last 2 years into Africa. We have 93 gigawatts of installed base across the continent. So, and we've done that with private sector. We've done that with utilities as well. But it takes you have to have a will to make things happen, not just from political, also companies, financial players, etc.
I want you to respond before you do, and I certainly want to talk about the Obama, but we have Max back, and I want him to finish his point, because Max, we lost you on rich people, and there was a lot of activity in the studio after that.
I was essentially saying that the utilities need to be reformed so that basically they're cleaned up, but also they're positioned to be utilities that will grow with our economies for the foreseeable future, for the next 50 years. Right now we have utilities that actually were built for last year or the last battle. We need utilities for the next war, the war we're in now, and for the next 50 years. And we're not there yet.
Point made. Andy, the sustainability of Power Africa after President Obama.
So one of the things that President Obama did, which was, I thought, was brilliant, and it goes to what Jay was saying about the importance of having people on the ground. This is the first ever U.S. presidential initiative that's headquartered on the African continent. But not only that, we have teams at the U.S. embassies all across the continent. We have over 40 advisors on the ground, and it's based in partnership, making sure not only that we're partnering with countries and with companies internationally, but we strongly encourage companies investing for the first time to partner with African companies as well. Power Africa is meant for Africans to control their own resources and create a sustainable model. Now, everybody likes this model, and the reason I say that is the Electrify Africa Act of 2015 was passed this year, sponsored by Republicans in the U.S. Congress, and passed unanimously. So there's a huge appetite for what we're doing. And as long as we continue to produce results, already we've had 5,000 megawatts of projects reach financial close since Power Africa was launched. That's half of our initial goal. And the reason we asked to triple our goal was because we saw in the first year the progress that we were making. So the model's moving, and as long as we produce results, we'll continue to see support for what we're doing.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm going to get you all to regroup at a later stage. So hopefully you're going to take my telephone call. I see you all looking away very quickly. But I want to end with a quick point from each of you. Let's say you're sitting around the boardroom table. As you say, you're talking to all of one another all the time. You're sitting around the boardroom table. You're coming to the end of the meeting, and there's one element that you are leaving that meeting on. Brian Dames, followed by the panel.
Yeah, no, if we do this again, Max must be in studio. So we've recently had such a discussion, actually. And what we walked away with, this is absolutely an exciting sector. The changes in technology just allows you to play a role and get projects on the ground and get to a point where you have a return pretty soon, and that's a very exciting space to be part of.
So who would have known this was actually reality television around the boardroom table, Jay Ireland?
Well, I look at it from a standpoint of getting projects completed, and the biggest impediment of getting those done is making sure that you can pull in the financing and the project financing wrapped around it, and tied into that is a risk perception versus risk reality. And I think that's something that we're all trying to focus in on, but it's still one of the Achilles heels, is we have a lot of projects, they're so-called not bankable, but this is Africa, and so there's going to be pieces of that which are going to be a little different than what people see in the Western Europe or the United States.
Andy Herskowitz.
So I would say that anybody who's not passionate about producing results in this sector should not be involved in this sector. And I drive my own team crazy because what we care about are the deals. How do you get these deals across the finish line? How do you get megawatts and connections on the board as quickly as possible? And we should all be up at night thinking about this. And if you don't have that passion, you shouldn't be doing it. So this is what we care about, and we can't do it. We have to do it all together. This is why we have such great partnerships.
Well, Max, we have to regroup, and you have to join us in studio, according to Brian Dames. Closing thoughts from you.
We have opportunity in Africa to power the future now. We've got to work together to do this. We can do it. Yes, we can. Let's do it.
While Sub-Saharan Africa's power sector faces many challenges, it's clear from our discussion today that there is real momentum driving change, but that policymakers do need to work quickly on embracing private sector initiatives, entrepreneurs, the small business out there, and create secure, enabling environments for long-term investments, especially when there's such enormous competition for capital across the world. Billions and billions of dollars are needed to change the energy landscape across the continent. The key, though, is that capital flows where capital is welcome. Thanks so much to my guests, Brian Dames, the CEO of African Rainbow Energy and Power, Jay Island President and CEO of GE Africa, Andrew Herskowitz, who is the coordinator of Power Africa, and Max Jarrett, Deputy Director of Africa Progress Panel via Skype from France.